Welcome to Diverse Voices Book Review. I'm Hopeton Hay. I'm really excited to have with me Tayyba Kanwal. She is a Pakistani-American writer from Houston, Texas, and we'll be talking about her debut story collection, Talking with Boys. Her award-winning work has appeared in journals such as Witness, Gulf Coast and Meridian. Born in Lahore, Pakistan, and raised in the United Arab Emirates, she holds an MFA from the University of Houston, where she was an Imprint C. Cambor Fellow, and an MS from the University of Oregon. Her career has spanned technology consulting through nonprofit management. She serves as senior editor at Conjunctions. And Tayyba, welcome to Diverse Voices Book Review.
Thank you, Hopeton. This is such an honor. Very excited to speak with you.
Well, I'm going to put you on a spot here because you're an editor with an MFA. So, with that background and having read probably dozens, if not hundreds of submissions, how do you edit yourself?
Ah, that is a great question. It takes me a long time, and I need the support of other readers. So, I do need to step away from my stories, give them, if not a many weeks, a few months, at least some months would be ideal. And then I think what happens is that I do a lot of writing in my own head, um, which doesn't make it to the page. And so my key question for my first readers, who I always have a series of trusted readers I send my work to, is what is missing? What didn't connect? What am I assuming? That's my biggest question. I feel like I trust my voice a lot. I'm not that worried about language. Those things I can see, and I actually get a lot of joy in working with sentences when I have enough distance. But what I absolutely can't see is those kinds of missing bits that are just in my head connecting the stories, and not on the page yet.
Well, your book is quite a journey. And the way I described it is it's the kind of book that you need to marinate in. It is not fast food. It is fine dining. I can just imagine sitting in front of a fireplace in a nice, comfortable chair with the book in my hand and just reading through it because there's such a emotional connection I have with a lot of your protagonists, and you write in a manner that protagonists that are believable. And I have to ask you, with all these stories in Lahore, in Dubai, and of course Houston, with the majority of your stories actually outside of Houston, your hometown where you've lived for quite a few years, how many of the stories are really inspired by the experiences you yourself have had living in Houston, living in Lahore, living in Dubai?
So, a lot of them, the nuggets, the characters, the people I know, are all reflected in there from just a lifetime of being in those homes, in those communities. It's not particular people, but they are reflective. Not to say stereotypical, but even somebody's mannerisms might have been something that stuck with me about the way a father is around his daughter versus his son. Those so that has trickled through from just being in those spaces a lot. I think, though, interestingly, most of my stories are not, they're inspired by things you would never guess. They're not culturally, they're not from incidents necessarily in these cultural spaces. So for example, there's a story in here where one of the characters, the story Little Mother, is actually my version of Ahab, who essentially was driven by a madness that he hid as a rational business goal in hunting down this whale, and took all these people with him. And she hides a cursed pregnancy in the same way with the same kind of madness. But to me, she's very Ahab. So
Well, that was interesting because I noticed that Huma
yeah,
in that story is in another story, and
yeah.
she refers to Little Mother. So I saw that connection there between these stories. So you had some characters inhabiting other stories.
Yes.
So talk about your decision, because this had to be purposeful,
Yeah.
to have connected stories. Talk about writing connected stories.
Yeah. Yeah, it actually enriched the book a lot once. So initially about a third of the book was the stories are all meant to be able to be read independently. They were all written as standalone tales. But about a third of the way through the book, I realized that some of these characters started making themselves known to me as people from another story. And once I saw that, they just started speaking, and every time I would write a new story, somebody from a previous story would come back. And I didn't want the stories to rely on what had happened before, but what it became for me was an enriching and a deepening of the universe. So once you start to see these people again, you realize how somebody was as a child, and it tells you a whole lot more about who they are as an adult. I have a father in Talking with Boys, the story itself, where he will not learn American Sign Language, even though his daughter needs this. And it sounds like a terrible, terrible thing as a father, except in another story, in fact, in Huma's story, you learn that he was physically abused, and sexually abused, and he doesn't like doing things with his body that are not intrinsic to him. So he has this resistance to doing newer things or acting in certain ways that are not natural to him. And he never lets his daughters know about that. But to me, that made him more understandable. So, it's making these people richer when you see them again, getting to know them more deeply. It's a connective tissue for this community because community is such an essential conversation in this book. The Pakistani culture is very community based. Individualism is not quite the thing. Although my newer, younger American, born characters play in that space, but they're still, their independences can be short-lived or is never fully the way you would expect from somebody who wasn't steeped in that culture.
Yeah, but we're talking with boys, the younger sister who he has to sign with clearly establishes her independence. I'm curious because her older sister's jealous
Yeah.
from the very beginning. Does she place a eye curse on her? She kind of curses her despite her best efforts. The curse doesn't work.
Yeah.
And these are characters that are often will fight against my term, not yours, the patriarchy.
Hmm.
Sort of this very oppressive view of the role of women within these stories, within the culture of these stories. And these are women that have agencies. And I'll tell you, I really love the mother-in-law from the very first story. Like, I guess I don't want to reveal too much, but I'll just say that I love the mother-in-law because with the story that kicks off the book, a young woman, 18, wants to get out of the house, oppressive father in Houston, Texas, to get together with a young man that's friends with her brother, that she had to break it off. And now she's reached out to him because she does not want to be, her life's dictated by her father, who has
Yeah.
plans for her. And just these characters, these young women just having to develop agency. Matter of fact, if there was one thing that was just grabbed me as the father of three daughters, is the way all your female characters are fighting for their own agency, fighting against their own culture that tries to sort of limit their aspirations, doesn't recognize their aspirations. Was that purposeful on your part?
I think this is what I've seen in growing up and with the women around me who have been very happy. And I have thought about, well, not all of them, but many have found happiness and have found success as they would define it for themselves. And that was always a question for me. How are they doing this? And one of the, one of the aspects I explore in this book is about how they use the system against itself. So in the very first story you're talking about, about the most appropriate thing this young woman could do was get married. And so
Yes.
that is what she does, but it gets her out of her father's house and she does it in a way she chooses. Um, she uses her own fa she mirrors her own father's actions and it can't be objected to. There is that, but I think there's also this cultural something I really admire about this culture in that there isn't a need to burn everything down and run away. I think people find success and fulfillment in the context of holding on to what they also love. So women love, if you love your children, which many mothers do, how do you keep your child and yet find your independence? And this mother-in-law that you were mentioning, Zeba, does exactly that, Her son is her pride and joy and her mission. And she uses the comforts of her husband's home, but doesn't in any way feel obliged to him. Although he's not unhappy with her. What are those fine dances where you make smart choices? I call these smart choices. Why be out on the streets if you can be in a home? You know?
Right. But there is I get the sense for me, a twinge of sadness,
Yeah.
which a twinge.
Hmm.
She likes the life, accepts it, and her pride and joy is not her husband or her relationship with her husband, but
Yeah.
with her son. On the other hand, when you go to Dubai
Yeah.
and whom is working for this wealthy woman, there is no twinge of sadness. She
Yeah.
seems deeply unhappy despite the wealth and all the adornments that comes with wealth.
Yeah. She has no escape. She actually is amazingly one of the most well-off people in the book and the least able to escape her circumstances. She can't, and this is sort of a function of where she is versus where Zeba is in the US. Zeba, I think, has a girlfriend who, we don't quite know because she doesn't tell us explicitly. But the wife in Mrs. Alawi doesn't have that option really, and is very chained down by her wealth. And it's also a question of, what kind of sacrifices you do make to hold on to what you do want. And I think Mrs. Alawi in Dubai has made a much bigger deal with the devil, and it's the deal she's made of those comforts that she craves and holds on to with her rich husband that weigh her down a whole lot more than, the deals that Zeba has made. So I think that that's where some of that is coming through for these two characters.
Well, one of my favorite characters, maybe my favorite character is listening to Zoya
Mm,
because she makes mistakes kind of, but knowingly. And this is what I liked about the way you wrote her, knowingly makes mistakes, knowingly tells little lies to her teacher, and kind of so human, so flawed, so what most people really don't want to admit to,
yeah.
that I made bad decisions. I was ungrateful with how I treated Harun when he came by, having gone by his house, the teacher that has sort of treated her like a daughter. Now, her mother, you got to tell me about that mother that just said, adios, I'm out. Tell us about this mother you created.
Yeah, I absolutely. She shows up in other stories too. She shows up in the story as a secondary character in the story Meher, where Meher is her cousin who is struggling with wearing the burqa, and this mother, Lubna, is the cousin who gets married young and feels like this is it. I've achieved sort of the pinnacle of my success. I'm going to go to the US with this husband. And so she had all these hopes, and she comes to the US and then is abandoned by her husband and his family and has absolutely no resources to raise her daughter. Um, and even through all of that, she realizes that all she's ever been looking for is a real connection, somebody who is truly willing to be honest with her. And it's not creature comforts. She wants a real love. And it is when when she's at the verge of it, in A Shade for the Window with Haroon, and it doesn't materialize, that she finally gives up. She feels like she just cannot have that. And it is at that point, it was not the material comforts, it was not immigration, it was the final feeling that she would not be able to find love, where she gives up and leaves, and decides she's just gonna go back home and figure out a way to exist and
But
not look for
Haroon's
love
pining
anymore.
for her.
I'm sorry.
Haroon is pining for
Haroon's
her.
pining for her, and he is such a loser.
Oh,
He
no,
can't.
don't say that.
I mean, we love Haroon. I hope you loved
Oh,
Haroon.
no. Is it because of his mother?
He is unable to break past his
Wow.
inability to express himself because of how he's been trained by his mother. And I had so much fun writing that story.
Wow, wow.
Yes.
You called your, one of the things I find when I talk to authors that there are characters that as a reader I don't like. Matter of fact, I had a discussion with my daughters. We had a very temporary book club. We were all supposed to read this book called The King of Ashes.
Hmm.
We all agreed to it. And my oldest daughter and I, we kept on it all the way. My youngest bailed out, I think, after the first chapter. And my middle daughter bailed out after the 17th chapter. So I asked her, what was it? Why, I'm trying to get to my middle daughter's like, she's wanting to ignore me, right? Dad, why are you asking me all these questions about why I bailed out? And she said it was because she didn't really like the main character,
Mm.
just really wasn't liking the main character. And then my oldest daughter said she really liked the development, the arc of the main character. And I thought it was interesting. They're only 2 years apart in age, but
Yeah.
they had very different takes on the character. And so when
Yeah.
you write, are you writing characters that you're hoping that your readers like? Not that they're perfect,
Yeah.
but that they like.
Well, I think I'm never really thinking about the reader when I'm
Wait,
writing.
wait, wait. No, not
It's
thinking about it.
right. No, it's the characters take over. I know that this story is going to work when a character starts behaving in ways that take me by surprise. They make their own decisions. They say things that surprise me. They make gestures that take me aback, and sometimes I find myself laughing out loud. Um, and I feel like that if I want to keep following them, I feel like my readers are going to want to keep following them. We are curious creatures. And we love watching people dig holes for themselves and then dig themselves out of holes. And I love what you said about your daughters and how honest they were about this process of going through it with you. And it made me think back to Zoya and the question you just asked. I'm so pleased you liked her. She's the last character in the book, and to me, she is the most American of my Pakistani-American characters. She was born here, and she truly, as much as she craves home, she wants to make her own home, and that is such an essentially American act to me. She doesn't want to it's not that she wants to be married. She doesn't want I mean, she wants those connections, but her home to her is one that she has built, and that's huge for her. But I think she reflects to me what I love about the current generation that, I have 20-year-olds. I know a lot of teenagers, and they are so honest. I feel like they are so honest about their flaws and what they struggle with, and what they're dealing with. And she just comes through like that for me. She was just speaking for herself the way I know 20-year-olds do now, you know.
And I want to bring up something. So, in one of the Dubai stories, a Huma story, and she's living with this family. And one of the things my daughter brought up, I was describing the book to her. I was like, this is a pretty good book. You ought to check it out. And I told her the story of Huma, and she said, well, she's read stories about immigrants working for wealthy families in Dubai who are almost kind of held kind of against their will. Could you tell us a
Yeah,
little bit about the backstory of that, of what's
yeah,
actually happening?
yeah. So I grew up in the Dubai of the 80s, 70s, and 80s, early 90s. And that's really when, even though those labor conditions carry on, that was the time when the country really was physically being built up from the ground. It still continues to be, but it really was going from nothing to the Dubai we know today. And it was built on, by the hands of these immigrants. And a lot of them, a lot of people, local people, were not in the service industry and they were not in the construction world. They were not working with their hands as much. And they were very well supported by their government. So these immigrants were necessary to maintaining those lifestyles. And they were employed not only by the locals, but also by other well-off immigrants. Um, they came under deception often, as far as, there was such a demand for workers that they were just brought in. And then once they showed up, they didn't realize what it was or where it was that they would be working, who truly they would be employed by. And they were often undereducated or uneducated, did not know anything about legal paperwork, immigration paperwork, and the employers would often just use that as a form of control. Having your passport taken and put away for safekeeping was pretty standard practice. Um, and there were many people who were held hostage by their passport not being able to be returned. You were under financial constraint, and you were under time limits by the law that you had to leave by a certain time or report in by a certain time. Very, very difficult work situations when you didn't have the knowledge of how the system was working. And honestly, I really struggled in the Dubai stories are some of my newest stories. I was not able to write work set in Dubai for so long because I did not know how to address this very uh, difficult, this very ugly situation in a way that wasn't whining. Because as you probably noticed from my other stories, there is no whining in my stories. And
No.
I have to say, Toni Morrison and Colson Whitehead, reading their work was so important to me in understanding how your characters maintain dignity and how this is their story as people, beyond their story as circumstances. I didn't want to write a story of circumstances. I wanted to write about people. And so, the MFA was great for that. I really got to dive deep into into how this is done. And that's how these stories came about.
So talk a little bit about your journey and getting to know Toni Morrison and Colson Whitehead writings.
Yeah. Well, I particularly chose, going to an MFA program because I had one mission, and that was to get to know American letters better. As an immigrant, and I wanted to write about, the place I am in now, and write in the context of the literature of this country. I grew up in Dubai, read a lot of British literature, especially Victorian literature, and none of that was reflective of contemporary literature. So I wanted to go back and specifically to a program, and I'm so grateful to the University of Houston for that. A program where literature was a big part of learning how to write. And so I took a lot of great classes where I dove into contemporary works and American works and just saw I truly there understood what it also meant to be American, much more so just from reading those works than I ever did living in this country for 30 years. Um, Literature's magic.
It is one of my missions is to get more of my male friends to read fiction because some of them have they don't see the value in it. And they read nonfiction, history, biographies, current events. But when you talk about literature, and I spend, part of my time haranguing them about the truth you can learn by reading literature. Talk a little bit about like there's an emotional truth that you can get to in literature that you can't, generally speaking, can't get to in nonfiction. Talk about those two.
Yeah, well, fiction is freeing because well, one, you can create context and situations in which you can truly test your characters, right? And those can be constructed. You can put them in a pressure cooker and see how they act. And so it's a great way to sort of reveal how we make choices. So there's definitely that. When you're following someone's choice making and their decisions, I think you're forming, especially when you're reading it in words and not just watching it being done, your imagination is creating those movements. And when you are creating that person, you're in a way becoming that person. At least that's how it works for me. So I think that that's huge. In my book, I there are several stories are surreal, or call it magic realist if you wish, you know. And I think to me that was I've been asked how the writing moves so just flows between the surreality and the realist pieces, and how I do that. And to me, it's just a spectrum because it's the surreal aspects of some of these stories are just a higher pressure cooker, I would say, and they're reflective more of the people's emotional states than they might be of any physical reality. And so if somebody feels like they're a bird, they become a bird in this book. And it's that ability to flow into our emotional states using storytelling, I feel like, is what pulls that off in fiction.
So I believe you had a career in consulting and technology. I think you have a master's in math,
Yes, I
a
do.
master's in, so did you always want to be a writer or did you sort of get there along the way?
Well, I had always been writing. I think that was always a part of me. And the mathematics and the storytelling to me are so parallel in my brain in that it's for me it's pattern making. Both are patterns. And both are abstractions, and ways of expressing concepts using symbols. And as you know, as any fiction writer will tell you, you're sitting at a coffee shop and all you're doing is noticing how people behave and making pulling out those patterns is what you see in life. That's what these stories are. So it's very similar. The tech consulting was sort of a digression out of math, honestly, in that I didn't want to be in academia. I'm too social a person for that. And so I went and got a job in the real world. But it was incredible training and just I think just getting very real, it provided me with the background to be able to step back and actually be a writer at this point in my life. I still work at a nonprofit, but I don't have the financial constraints I might have had if I had been writing at 21. And so I would say I'm just grateful for that as a very practical choice. Um, I made at that time. I was always writing, you can't help it. And this is why I came back to it now and finally got my book out because it just built up. I was writing at night in the years before I joined my MFA. I wasn't getting any sleep because I'm going to work and then these stories were telling themselves. And so at some point, it just built up to a point where I felt like it was time. It was time to give my attention to literature the way I'd always wanted to.
I saw you on YouTube, a panel discussion of editors. I believe it was back in 2022.
Mm,
And the moderator talked about some editors when they get the slush, he called it, all
yeah.
those manuscripts, that some editors, if they don't like the first sentence, they don't read it any further.
Mm.
So when you were writing your short stories, how often did you rewrite the first sentence?
Oh my gosh. It's actually rare for me. My stories have two things that tend to stay with them. One is the first sentence, and that's very important to my stories. You might have noticed how the voice in each story is very different. Some are very contemporary, some are almost mythological voices. The first sentence sets that tone. I get to know the narrator of the story through that first sentence, and that narrator is going to continue speaking. So often it's very much what it was when I'd opened up because this is the person who started telling the story. Um, in The other thing that stays in a story for me always is a nugget of an image for some reason, there's always one moment that I know is going to define the story or be in there, and the story is going to blossom out of. And so that has always stayed in each story.
What I found interesting, and I don't read a lot of short story collections, mostly novels, a lot of nonfiction too, was how you were telling stories that covered 20 years or 30
Hmm.
years in a short story.
Yeah,
And just we're watching the arc of the character, not just in a week
yeah,
or a day,
yeah.
but like the Saint of Horses
Yes,
and rebelling against his father.
yeah,
And his father just kicks him out. And, you know, it had a happy ending.
yeah,
Yes, you know. And part of what I found valuable from reading the story, Mali and the Saint of Horses, which was set in 1950, the Ori by Lahore, was you had two characters that were abandoned
yeah,
by their community,
yeah,
just abandoned, yet they persevered, but not in an overly romantic way, in a
yeah,
very practical, focused on their art. So, talk a little bit about building that kind of story where it isn't romance first, it's the
yeah,
art first.
yeah. That story really came out of this obsession of, well, it came out of two places, talking of nuggets. One was I started researching pottery in Pakistan because there is a classic folktale called Mahiwal about two potters who fall in love with each other, a woman and a man, and how society keeps them apart. I didn't want to retell that story, but I was fascinated by this idea of pots and what they can do. So it came out of the art form of pottery. And once I started reading that, I discovered that there's this thing called the Potter's Book, which is a manual used by the potters, almost like a biblical manual. They say it's come down from God. And then I was fascinated by this idea of how we teach, how we interpret and hold on to instructions we feel like are sent to us by God. Um, and I never, I don't want to wander into sort of religious territory here, but I am very curious about that kind of dogmatism and how you deal with it. And so this character, the Saint of Horses, not only a potter, also became the person who contests a dogmatic view of instructions from the divine.
Yeah, it reminds me of Spinoza, this philosopher up in Portugal, and how he was banished from his community because he didn't believe in God the way his Jewish community did and was
Yeah,
banished.
yeah. Yes, yeah, exactly. And so what he sticks to is the essential truth of the art. I mean, that's his way of questioning those instructions. And so the art becomes his language and the language of love between him and Melly. And they both have their own skill sets with that too. They're not competing with each other, they're complementary to each other. And so their love too is really a form of complementary art. Um, where each doesn't necessarily give into the other, which is also it's an interestingly complex story to me even today. I enjoyed that play.
Yeah, even in your last story with Zoya, not going to California,
Yeah, will not follow the guy.
did not follow the guy. Is that un-American?
Right?
I
If
don't know. Maybe not today, but
Yeah,
20, 30 years ago, that
yes,
would have been the expectations. And so
right.
she almost seemed relieved that she didn't follow him.
Yeah, yeah. Because she wants to build her own home. And to me, this is the contemporary American young woman who knows herself. I see that. I see that in my daughter and her friends, and I'm very proud of them for it. The guys are great and go for them if they are important enough to you, but also be very real about what else is important to you. And they are.
Well, I want to get unserious here because you've done a lot of serious reading.
Yeah.
What are your guilty reading pleasures?
Ah, my guilty reading pleasures. Oh my goodness.
Come
That's a
on,
good question.
fess up.
I love fantasy. I will read about elves anytime. I will read about
Ah,
magic anytime in high fantasy. I can't get enough of them.
you got to give us a book name or an author. You're
I
not getting
liked
away.
All right. I did like this is great. I liked Spinning Silver by Novak. That's her last name. That was wonderful. That was actually a retelling. That's the other thing. It was a retelling of a fairy tale. I will endlessly read retellings of fairy tales. So, although those are not always light, those can be pretty heavy.
Oh, very
Uh,
heavy at times.
yeah, but I will read and reread The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and
How many times have you seen the movies?
many. So yeah, that's my gimme elves, gimme elves.
Well, Tayyba Kanwal, author of Talking with Boys, it's been very delightful, and I really enjoyed your collection. Thank you so much for being a guest on Diverse Voices Book Review.
Thank you, Hopeton. I hope to see you and our other Austin friends at a couple of things if
Tell
you have
us.
time. Yeah, up in well on online, Writers League of Texas has invited me on January 15th to their panel called Writing Toward Hope. So you can just go online to their website. It's the third Thursday of January. I would be delighted to see you there. And then in person, I'm going to be in Georgetown, which I'm so excited about at Lark and Owl Booksellers in conversation with Jessica Godot. And that's on January 24th at 7 p.m. Please come out, Austin. I would love to see you
All
there.
right, well, we'll welcome you in Austin if you admit that the Missioner School is better than the writing at U of H
I have
program.
I have a few of my favorite fellow writers right now from the Michener School. So they are my good friends.
Well, you have a great day. Take care.
Thank you so much, Hopeton. This was lovely.
Bye.
Bye-bye.